Hello, my name is Tolg, and I exist, therefore I think too much. I am tired because I drank sleepy time tea, and I didn't want to get messed up by Nietzsche again. That really sent me. So I decided, I have many favorite books. I decided to read one of my favorite chapters from one of my favorite books instead. And you're gonna suffer through it if you like. The book is I Should Have Kissed Her More by Alexander Kingand. The chapter is chapter 2. This daydream about my funeral, in all its minute completeness, came to me early one morning while I was soaking myself in the bathtub. I often think about my death, several times each day as a matter of fact, but this was the first time I'd ever dwelt at any length on my final obsequies. Later on, it came to me that I'd overlooked a good many other people who were quite likely to appear on such an occasion. Myra Crosley, for instance, was more than an even bet to turn up for a last look at my mortal remains. I hadn't thought about her in many years either, but I had a strange feeling that parts of me were still in orbit on the outer fringes of her peculiar awareness. I had originally come to know Myra in an unusual and rather romantic manner. I was living at that time over in the East 40s in the Turtle Bay section of New York somewhere, and I recall that although it was the height of summer, I had somehow managed to acquire a rather shattering cold. I had been suffering under the wretchedness of it for nearly 10 days, when one evening, after I got home from work, I felt so completely pooped I decided to call my doctor and have him come over for a look at me. The girl from his answering service told me that he'd gone away for the weekend, but she suggested that I consult another physician who was prepared to take over his patients during his absence. For some reason, I decided against it, and after I had hung up the receiver, I felt suddenly so feeble that I crawled onto my bed, clothes and all, and instantly fell into a deep stupor. I must have been lying there for quite a long while, too, because when I finally opened my eyes, it was obviously pretty late at night. You can always tell what hour of the day it happens to be in the busier midtown sections of Manhattan by the mere sound of the traffic that happens to pass your door. I judged it to be about 1:30 or 2 o'clock. My mouth was bitterly dry, my head seemed to be on fire, and I felt like a man who had reached an absolutely desperate extreme of physical and mental exhaustion. I happened to be between wives at the time, and because such a circumstance was a rare occasion in my life, I began to feel very sorry for myself in my lonely and abandoned condition. Let me make this a little clearer. Ever since I was 17 years old, and even long before that, I had, one way or another, never been without some female companionship. This is to say, there was someone around to listen to my jabbering and who, in an emergency, was prepared to hand me an ice bag or a cup of hot tea. Now then, although my little apartment was quite comfortable and beautifully furnished and lacking in no advantage that a modern landlord with high rents could provide, I was suddenly steeped in the deepest doldrums of depression because once, for a wonder, I was living quite alone. My formerly tight little world was unhinged. Fierce, deadly draughts were blowing at me from all directions, and not a single compassionate hand was stretched out to comfort or protect me. It was a really dark moment in my life. I hardly ever took time out for self-pity, but because this was a new sensation for me, I wallowed in it to the point of ultimate shamelessness. Also, I had, as it later turned out, about 104 degrees fever, and my carcass was racked by all the ghastly syndromes of a badly neglected case of influenza. At this point, as I felt myself sinking into oblivion again, I reached down in sudden desperation, pulled off one of my shoes and flung it wildly in the direction of the nearest window. And then I must have passed out again, because when I opened my eyes, a tall, pretty young woman dressed in a very chic peignoir was leaning over me and putting a thermometer in my mouth. When I made a movement to get up, she gently pushed my head back on the pillow and said, "Keep still till I take your temperature." Well, I thought, this is surely a most agreeable figment of my fevered imagination, and properly enough, she has a tiny mole on her neck, and besides that, her touch is as cool as the fingers of an early morning lilac bush. Has anyone ever had such an insane life as I? Here I am, dying of pneumonia or something worse, and suddenly this wonderfully composed hamadryad shows up at my crumpled bedside and puts a revivifying icicle into my burning mouth. She took out the thermometer, looked at it critically, and said, "How long have you been lying here like this anyway?" "Since early this evening," I said. "But you've been sick a lot longer than that, haven't you?" "Yes," I said. "Could I please have a drink of water?" She went into the kitchen and brought me a drink. "You ought to have a doctor," she said. "Your temperature is way up, and somebody ought to stay here and take care of you. Is there anyone you want me to call?" "We'll have to get a nurse," I said. "I'm all alone just now, and most of my friends are away for the summer. I'm sorry to trouble you like this." "That's all right," she said. "I'll make you a pitcher of lemonade and get you some aspirins from over in my house, and in the morning, if you aren't any better, I'll ring my doctor and get him to find you a nurse. I'll be right back." "Just a minute," I said. "What's your name, miss?" "My name is Myra," she said. "Myra Crosley. I'm your neighbor across the way. That is to say, I live in the next street, really, but our gardens adjoin. That is how your shoe nearly smacked me on the head while I was opening my window. I'll be right back." In a little while, she returned with the lemonade and the aspirins, and her beautiful and tranquil presence so definitely reactivated the vital juices in my harassed frame that I was even able to go to the bathroom and change into my pajamas. However, this splurge of energy did not last very long, and a few minutes after I hit the bed, I dozed off again. I woke 3 or 4 times during the night, and each time I did, she quietly got up from the couch across the room where she had bedded herself down and gave me a cool drink. I tried to thank her through my cracked and swollen lips, and once I even warned her about a possible infection to herself. "Don't worry," she said. "I've been a lot around sick people, and I never caught anything yet. You just try to sleep, and we'll get the doctor as soon as it is daylight." I was still sleeping when the doctor eventually arrived, and he turned out to be an old friend of Myra's, and even in the state I was in, I had no trouble noticing that he had more than just a casual interest in her. He was a young guy with a shock of black hair, and he obviously loathed me on sight. Nevertheless, the healer in him took the upper hand in our first encounter, and although I'm sure he considered my ailment an intrusive nuisance in her life, he ministered to me quite effectively and proceeded about his business with an air of detached efficiency that I rather welcomed. I discovered in a little while that Myra had a whole slew of such Lancelots in her entourage, and that most of them, including her lawyer, her dentist, and even her liquor dealer, had all at one time or another proposed marriage to her. Meanwhile, I was good and sick, and Myra, who by default seemed to have assumed responsibility for my case, decided not to hire a nurse for me after all. "I can look after him this weekend," she said, "and if he isn't improved by Monday, I can always find somebody then." The doctor and I tried to talk her out of it, but she finally had her way, and with mouth pursed in prissy disapproval, the Asclepius finally left us. Because this little event, I mean the emergence of Myra Crosley as a midnight Florence Nightingale in my life, could so easily be developed into a hideous serial for the Saturday Evening Post, I have purposefully trimmed it of all extraneous details. I have told it as baldly and unceremoniously as I know how, but as is plain to see, the romantic giblets were all present nevertheless, and despite my strong desire to tell about this as matter-of-factly as I can, I'm unable to keep them out of sight any longer, because Myra was nothing if not a 21-carat darling. By the following Monday morning, I was so much improved that I was able to sit out in the sun in my own little backyard, and when the next weekend rolled around, I even walked across to her little garden and paid my first visit, Chazelle. After that, A good many unaccountable things happened, and although I have frequently thought about them in intervening years, I must confess I never quite understood the curious psychobiochemical mystery that remained as an insoluble sediment at the bottom of our curious communion. It stands to reason that I got quite a crush on her. That was to be expected, and there was nothing insoluble about that. What was strange, almost from the very beginning though, was the fact that I was perfectly content to keep my relationship to her in a state of mercurial ambivalence, that I had no desire to establish any binding certainty between us, although it was perfectly clear to me that Myra had come to care a good deal about me too. Now, remember that I've always been a marrying type of man. I mean that I've never been happy with girlfriends who were available whenever I just happened to have a hankering for them. In short, I was never the a la carte type, and although I've been occasionally involved with certain ladies whom I didn't finally marry, I can truthfully say that by and large my existence has always had a certain table d'hote stability about it. I liked Myra's way of life, as well as her person, very much. She had a fabulous apartment and her garden, which at its inception must have been just a dingy backyard like my own, had, under her painstaking ministrations, become something more than merely decorative. She had a great deal of taste, and I say taste advisedly, because I have some rich friends who simply transplant whole tropical retreats onto their city rooftops, and these arboreal explosions only testify to their sound financial condition and nothing else. At the end of each summer, these feverish landscapes have to be promptly thrown down the garbage chutes. Not Myra's. She definitely had a way with plants, and the most collapsed and ailing vegetable derelict began to prosper unaccountably under the persuasive urgings of her cool, competent hands. At the end of each summer, her little garden was carefully packed away under burlap, and at the first sign of spring, everything began to bloom magically back into abundant life again. Her home was equally well balanced. She had filled it with early American antiques, but I had seen time and again how in other people surrounding such a collection tended to engender a certain stultifying museum atmosphere, where all bodily or spiritual relaxation was out of the question. She had a lot of style that was never oppressively evident. I suppose she was fashionable in the noblest sense of that almost senseless term. After we had become lovers, I had ample opportunity to study her at close range and at my leisure, and I can truthfully say, even after all these years, that I have never met anyone who moved in this uneasy world with a better sense of form and tempo. In the beginning, I used to think it was perhaps this ever-present feeling of instinctive decorum that precluded a final sense of intimacy between us, no matter how ultimately involved we became with one another. Later, I discovered that this was not so, that my failure to achieve a total and uncritical submersion into the mainstream of Myra's life was due to some other factor, was probably due to the enormous difference in the spiritual and physical raw materials from which our characters had originally drawn their first conditioning, and that our emotional confrontation had occurred too late for an altogether successful welding. This was also, of course, pure moonshine, since none of the other women I did get permanently involved with had ever had more than mere fragments of experience that could in any rational way be related to my own peculiar past existence. I really didn't know what was wrong. It is particularly puzzling, since Myra was surely one of the most beautiful women I had ever known. She was about 27 at the time I met her, and had been divorced nearly 3 years. She told me that she had been married to an aviation engineer whom she had originally met at college, and that their separation had had the usual depressing side effects, but had, generally speaking, worked itself out without rancor. I didn't marry a stick-in-the-mud businessman, she said. I married a stick-in-the-air aviator. He was never home for more than 2 or 3 days at a time, and I stood it as long as I could. I stood it for 5 years. We first met when we were practically kids, and we certainly should never have gotten married at all. The real reason I got mixed up with him, I suppose, was that all my friends at school had gotten engaged all around me, and since he was a good-looking boy with good prospects, I thought, why not? But surely you must have loved him, I said. It isn't hard to be in love at 19. Most of the girls I knew had gone to this co-ed school so that they'd find somebody to marry. I suppose that is the reason so many girls do jam into those colleges all over the country. It wasn't my reason, but I fell into the general pattern out of sheer non-resistance and also out of adolescent stupidity. Myra was tall, about 2 inches taller than I, which, by the way, didn't bother me in the least, because I'm not one of those people who have to dominate their women by size. It certainly never seemed to worry her. She had a tawny complexion, dark hair, gray-green eyes, and carried herself like a high-priced mannequin. But actually, she never could have been a fashionable model, because she had a sensuous figure and buoyantly developed mammary glands. As far as I've been able to observe, the seductive pear-shaped buttocks of the Venus callipygus never appear in Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. I just recently read in the magazine section of a local newspaper an article written by 2 of the best-known ladies in the world of television commercials in which these highly solvent cadavers cheerfully boasted about their physical limitations. "We have no cleavage problem," they said, "and although we have the bodies of slender adolescent boys, we manage to earn $200,000 a year posing for TV advertising." All I can tell you is that these 2 pathetic creatures look like nothing so much as a couple of broom handles with exploded birds' nests on top, bleached birds' nests at that. As I looked at their sparse, angular dimensions, I couldn't help wondering what a lover could possibly do when he was alone with one of these hags. I suppose he could settle down to passionately fondling their money bags for lack of anything else to hold on to. At any rate, these weren't my problems with Myra. She had originally come from Georgia, of all places, but had with infinite patience and taste managed to lose every last vestige of her native accent. There is no denying that she was still a Southerner. Some of her food preferences, and, I think, some minor shades of her social predilections were unquestionably traceable to the state of her origin. One of my friends, who was also stuck on her and who wondered why I didn't get really serious about her, said to me one day, "I think you'd marry Myra tomorrow if only she weren't white." He was wrong, of course. I had a great deal of respect for the way she had integrated herself in the rhythm of her peculiar life. She was a beautiful woman living alone in a big, mischievous town like New York, and so it was inevitable that eventually she would become the much victimized target not only of proposals and of propositions, but even of certain amorous patterns of behavior which were frequently not too far removed from actual coercion and even blackmail. Amidst all these mostly male machinations, Myra had somehow managed to maintain her admirable poise. Day after day she was exposed to the smirks and oglings of every accidental messenger boy who happened to stumble into her quiet life, and yet she functioned as tranquilly as if an invisible protective curtain had been draped around her. It was quite a performance. I was very much impressed with it, and after a while I became deeply attached to her, and the habit pattern of my life needed her very badly. We stuck it out together that way for the better part of 2 years, and then one day a magazine offered me a job which made it necessary for me to go to Central America. I took this job quite suddenly, packed my bags, and went off on the trip without her. I won't pretend that it was easy. She had been unbelievably kind to me, and I was certainly very fond of her. During our relationship, I had found many surprising facets in her character, which profoundly affected and delighted me. She had an ardently passionate nature. She played an excellent game of chess, and she was deeply and intelligently devoted to all the arts I myself cherished most. Later on, I often used to think of her with profound regret and wish I had paid greater heed to the whispering voices in my heart that had urged me to marry her. My life might have taken an entirely different turn. Who knows? I saw her only once more after the critical separation which took me out of her life. Some 15 years ago, I ran into her again on the day before Christmas, in front of Macy's on 34th Street. The big city holiday madness was churning all around us when we suddenly looked into each other's eyes and instinctively reached out our hands in greeting. I touched her cold cheek with my lips, and a great gladness came over me as I held her in my arms for a moment. But in less than 30 seconds it became clear to me that we had really nothing to say to each other. At least, nothing that could be said in a holiday shopping crowd in the heart of New York. Also, I believe that neither one of us was actually too anxious to warm up the fragments of our memories in any of the nearby coffee shops, so after exchanging a few standard banalities on the rackety street corner, we parted again, and this time for good. When we finally shook hands, she said, "Are you married?" "Not at the moment," I said. She looked surprised. "So what happens if you should suddenly get ill?" "Oh," I said, "I suppose I'll have to shift for myself as best I can." "I see," she said. "Besides, if anything does go wrong, you can always throw a shoe through somebody's window, can't you? You see, a damned hep chick, too. So what could have been wrong? Could it be that she always did just the right thing at the right time?" I suddenly remembered that in the old days, she'd always had the right books, the right magazines, and even the right phonograph records on tap. Richard Tauber singing Mattinata, and Bunny Berrigan blowing I Can't Get Started, and all the other stuff that was current among the truly informed. I'm sure that nowadays she'd have songs by Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, Carmina Burana by Carl Orff, and very probably one of Gary Mulligan's latest releases. Could that have been what botched it between us? I never knew. I still don't. I've just reread all that I've written so far about Myra and myself, and I find that in my eagerness to be totally detached, I seem to have drained off the whole meaningful marrow of that story. I think I've been just a little too objective and have only succeeded in giving something of a lopsided account of the various happenings between us. After all, 2 years is quite a long spell for a modern romance, and it stands to reason that our relationship must have suffered quite a bit of upsy-downsiness during that time. It did. There were occasions when I couldn't imagine my life without her, and yet it sometimes happened that I could barely get myself to cross the threshold of that bewitching house of hers. For instance, I've never bothered to mention the fine old acacia tree that stood in the corner of Myra's garden, and the strange influence that this anomalous arboreal exile had on my whole emotional life. In fact, I think I can safely say that it was this tree more than anything else that set the tone for my peculiar misgivings about her, and in due time came to cast an ominous shadow across my euphoric heart. This tree had originally stood in someone else's backyard, quite a few blocks away from us, and Myra and I had just accidentally spied it through an open house door one Sunday afternoon. "Look," I said, "an acacia tree. What a strange thing to see in the middle of a stony quarry like New York." "It is a beauty, isn't it?" she said. "I wonder how it got here." "In the spring the blossoms have such a sweet odor," I said, "that as a child, visiting some friends in Hungary, where I saw this tree for the first time, I got so drunk with the smell of it I couldn't stop myself from eating a whole cluster of flowers." "The same thing happened to me," she said. "I guess children are so impulsive and direct in their love, it must be a common thing for them to do things like that. I remember I used to do it with jasmine blossoms too." And that was that. But soon afterward I had to go out of town for 3 days, and when I came back to New York, the acacia tree was standing in Myra's garden, and what's more, some of its longest branches even reached over as far as my own back windows. She had bought the tree, of course, and I remember quite clearly that at the time my mind consistently refused to picture any possible series of sequential events that could logically have led up to this transaction. I don't know why, but there seemed something ruthlessly piratical about the way that the tree had been hijacked from its native loam and been transplanted, root and branch, into our compound just for our special delectation and pleasure. I've avoided saying it so far, but Myra was certainly very rich. What's more, she had always been rich, and although she had a stunning wardrobe and moved about amid unmistakably costly surroundings, I'd somehow managed for quite a while to ignore the basic implications of such a taste of affairs. So she was rich. So what? Well, it didn't really matter to me, since a rich wife is not necessarily an insurmountable handicap. Actually, it shouldn't have disturbed me any more than the fact that she was a couple of inches taller than I. But, after a little while, it did disturb me. Mostly because her family had always had money, and so there were unquestionably whole areas of human experience for which Myra had no frame of reference whatever. It wasn't only that she'd never missed a meal in her life. It was simply that the anxieties and misgivings of her past had been trivialized by the overly facile application of money. Since she had been orphaned in early childhood, her problems had always been glibly dealt with by well-fed, well-feed lawyers and administrative guardians who casually pretended that the world was populated by an aggregation of greedy mendicants who were more than anxious to be of service to their financial superiors. I don't mean to imply that she was heartless or unimaginative, not a bit of it, and unlike other young women of her brand and ilk, she had no need to multiply her sensations indefinitely just to feel alive, but the taint existed just the same. She was, occasionally, rather alarmingly detached. That was the real spook that shattered my complacence. You see, I'd always had the feeling, long before I'd ever known Myra, that it was much safer and saner for all concerned if the rich consorted exclusively with the rich. They had the same basic advantages and the same common ailments. They understood one another as kangaroos or giraffes understand one another. Their environmental conditions were not unique to them, and they were able to communicate without the slightest fear of being misunderstood. The antennae along their alarm centers were tuned to the same critical wavelength, and whatever frightened or reassured one of them would tend to terrify or assuage all the rest. You mustn't think that I invented this setup for a deadly syllogism just out of an overabundance of wit or frustration. Oh no, I'd come to my earnest conclusions by having frequently had occasion to hobnob with some of the well-heeled members of the human species, and I'd discovered quite early that despite their earthbound status, they had, nevertheless, certain undeniable extraterrestrial attributes which definitely cut them off from a good measure of common human experience. They couldn't help it. It just happens to them. Naturally, my diagnosis applies only partially to the newly rich. They, after all, can still remember the days of their great down and outness, and so they tend to overact and to overcompensate in all directions. I think they are really just like you and me, only a little more annoying. I'm talking specifically about the ones who've always had it, and whose seat in heaven has been as surely reserved as their box at the opera. And so I think if there is any explanation as to why I did not get myself permanently mired in Myra's honeypot, it is a fair guess to say that it was much too golden for me, and that the rainbow which led to it might in the end not prove even as serviceable for my purposes as a rusty fire escape. Come to think of it, there's another girl I never married because she was too rich for my plebeian taste. Her name was Hilda Varsi, and her people owned the numberless varsity dress shops all over the country. The first time I came to see her, she lived in a penthouse atop the family mansion in the East 50s, and her snug little eyrie was fitted out with the sexiest furniture I'd ever seen. I never knew that furniture could ever get itself into such a condition of seductive, almost orgiastic frenzy. The curvaceously twisted legs of all those chairs and couches were encased in lacy frills and drawers of all sorts, and if you moved a few of these pieces together, it instantly looked like a Ziegfeld chorus line. I was young enough and silly enough to be gassed by all this writhing upholstery, and Hildy suited such an environment so perfectly that I accepted each day's goodness without a single Jewish afterthought. Later on, I began to notice that my beloved never wore the same dress or hat for a second time, which made some kind of sense too, since her people were in the business. What made no sense to me after a while was that she'd bundled up all these one-day-old clothes and handed them to her maid to get rid of. I said to her, "Hildy, what does your maid do with all those discarded hats and dresses? Sell them, or what?" "I don't know," said Hilda. "I think she gives them to the milkman or the letter carrier or to whoever happens to want them." In that case, I said, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me take them, because I know at least a dozen young women in the village who'd be damned grateful if they could get such nice clothes, and believe me, you'd be doing a real kindness to them. All right, she said. I'll fill you up a couple of suitcases each week, and you can give them away to your friends if you like. And that's what she did. The hired help around the house didn't much care for this public-spirited move. I used to get pretty dirty looks from all of those with whom I had any personal contact, and subtle ramblings of mutiny came in rebellious waves, even from below stairs, from the kitchen and pantry regions, and spent themselves effectually on the granite walls of my indifference. In a little while, a real cabal was formed against me by that group of leeches, and while I didn't actually find my ground glass in my meals, the service in my direction deteriorated perceptibly. What made it worse was that the kids to whom I passed on all this lush haberdashery would write fulsome letters of thanks to Hilda, and that fine girl would sometimes read these gushy thank you notes aloud over the dinner table. Meanwhile, all those freshly discarded clothes that I lugged downtown every week created an absolute fashion revolution along the MacDougall Street and the territories adjacent thereto, and at least half a dozen girls would be waiting for me every Monday night when I usually arrived with a fresh haul. It was great while it lasted, and then, as is inevitable in sidereal human affairs, Hilda had a birthday coming up. You can imagine my problem. What can you possibly give a girl who throws away a complete wardrobe every 24 hours? You can do something spectacular, like get her pregnant, of course, but to tell you the truth, the thought never occurred to me. But I did think of something that seemed to augur a feasible solution to my dilemma. I remembered my friend Chris Postle, who was, in a manner of speaking, in the jewelry business. This fellow, Postel, was a cripple, and had for years been immobile from the waist down. He hadn't always been in this jam, and I'd known him quite well long before he was. It had happened to him during a duck hunt. He'd been frozen into a marsh of some kind for nearly 10 hours, and when they finally thawed him out, he'd permanently lost the use of his lower limbs. Chris had always earned a very good living by making jewelry, very fine jewelry, by hand. He could take a piece of gold or platinum wire and spin such a filigree of wonders out of it that some of the fanciest Fifth Avenue shops used to bid eagerly for his services. It was a real stroke of fortune that I'd remembered him, because it was more than likely that he'd have something for me that might surprise even a not very surprisable girl like Hilda. I recalled, while I was thinking about him, that I had probably been the last person he'd talked to in America before he'd gone off on a world cruise some 5 years ago. I'd gone down to the boat to see him off and recalled remonstrating with him for going on such a daffy trip. I mean, he didn't have much money really, and I had a feeling that he'd land somewhere on the other side of the world in his wheelchair and maybe get himself into an awful mess. So although it was pretty late for caution, since they were going to pull up the gangplank any minute, I pleaded with him to give up the whole silly travel idea and to stick around where some well-intentioned people might be able to give him some help if he needed it. "What's the sense of your going away in the condition you're in?" I said. "You're just looking for trouble, it seems to me." "I have to go," he said. "I have to go because I'm looking for someone somewhere in the world who'll say to me, 'Arise and walk.'" In short, there was no reasoning with him. He was gone a little over 2 years, and he certainly seemed to have done pretty well for himself. When he came back, he rented a fine shop, and for the first time since his accident, he hired a trained nurse to care for him. There was a good deal of gossip about him at the time of his return. Rumor had it that he'd successfully smuggled a load of precious stones, emeralds, sapphires, and rubies back into the States, and he'd hidden his swag in the extra-large hubcaps of his wheelchair. It was certainly possible, but I didn't give it much thought. During his absence abroad, Chris had spent most of his time in China, and he told me some fantastic stories about that country whenever I came by his house to pass an evening with him. He'd opened a small jewelry shop in Canton, and it seems he had no trouble finding some good customers among the wealthy foreigners there. But one day, Chris told me, a couple of coolies stepped into my shop, and one of them put an American dollar bill on the counter. The other one, who'd come along to act as an interpreter, tried to explain what their visit was all about. It seems that these boys wanted Chris to make them a wire candlestick with 2 branches. They'd watched him through the window and observed his dexterity with metal, and the owner of the dollar bill had decided to commission him for this job. I couldn't quite understand what they wanted, said Chris, because when they made me a rough sketch of what they had in mind, I could see that they particularly didn't seem to want a base on this candelabrum of theirs. They wanted the vertical centerpiece, the trunk, so to speak, to be made out of just a thicker piece of wire. And then it occurred to me that maybe they just wanted it unfinished on the bottom, so they could hammer it in wherever they wanted it, nail into a plank or a table or whatever. Well, at any rate, I made it for them out of good strong wire, and of course I refused to take any pay for it. That dollar represented a week of brutally hard labor for that coolie, and I wanted no part of it. I just warned them to keep their mouths shut about the whole business, or I'd have been working overtime for all the underprivileged people in Canton. They came back a couple of days later, and they were very pleased with the job I'd done for them, and it seems I'd been absolutely right about the center wire too, because they even asked me to sharpen it for them to a fine point. I am telling you this particular story at this particular time because, as you will discover in a moment, it has a peculiar relevance to the matter of my impending visit to Chris Postel's shop in search of a suitable birthday trinket for Hilda. Well, continued Chris, a couple of days later I had to go to the bank, and as I was wheeling myself along, I suddenly recognized my coolie customer, who was kneeling on a pad right near the main entrance. He was a beggar, and you know what he had done? He had shaved his head and had driven the center spike of my wire candlestick straight into the top of his skull. He had a couple of green candles burning in the 2 branches, and the hot wax was dripping right down on his bare scalp. I was so staggered, I just sat there and gaped at him for a full minute. I must say he didn't really attract as much attention as you'd expect, but then you must remember it was China after all, and if you want to be a beggar in Canton, you sure have to trot out some unusual reasons for sympathy. Canton was certainly no bush league town for beggars. They had the best, and what's more, they displayed the most horrifying physical disfigurations that I've ever seen. A mere small-time cripple like myself would have starved to death among them. Later on, Chris said, this beggar, who seemed to have lasted a lot longer than I'd expected, one day brought 3 pieces of unusually fine jade to my shop, and I bought them from him very cheaply. I think he knew he might have gotten a little more somewhere else, but I told him I wasn't a rich man, and so he left them to me for my price, out of gratitude for the favor I had done him. At any rate, I had seen these pieces of jade after Chris returned to the States, and he had once even playfully suggested that if I ever became engaged, he would let me have one of the stones for the very small price he had originally paid for it in Canton. I was really counting on that vague promise of his when I went over to his shop a few days before Hilda's birthday, but the memory of it and a sliver of pale hope were certainly alive in me. Of course, there was always the high probability that he'd already sold the 3 stones long ago, but he hadn't. "Oh, I've still got them," he said, when I told him the nature of my errand. "We'll make a beautiful brooch out of the darkest of them, and save the other 2 for a ring some day later on." When I called for my gift on the morning of the birthday, Chris and I had a real unveiling. The lovely jewel in its dark gold setting was resting against a cushion of night blue velvet, and the whole was enclosed in a fabulously carved teakwood box. "May this be worthy of her," said Chris as we shook hands. When I arrived at Hilda's home, I could hardly get into the living room for the mountain of presents that every relative and friend and every far-sighted clothing manufacturer in America had managed to expedite to her door. It was not only stupendous, it was positively embarrassing. She stood in the midst of all these treasures, dressed only in a bra and panties, so as to facilitate the trying on of endless bed jackets, blouses, skirts, ski pants, and other wearables that kept bursting out of seemingly inexhaustible volcanoes of tissue paper. At last, when she had fallen completely pooped into the arms of one of her nymphomanic chairs, I stepped forward and presented my gift. She loved it. She really did. She had no idea of the great, still beauty of the jewel, and she certainly had no adequate appreciation for the nature of the fabulous setting. But she did know that jade of that color and quality was very expensive, and while I clutched desperately at the lace drawers of her chair, she kissed me with considerable passion. In a little while, after she had replenished her forces by a couple of old fashions, she continued with the relentless rape of the cardboard boxes around her, and when 2 hours later we were finally ready to go out for dinner, she discovered that she had somehow unaccountably misplaced my gift. "It isn't lost," she said. "It's in one of those smaller boxes. I'm sure I put it away especially along with the tortoise-shell opera glasses. I'll tell Mother to go through all these packages very carefully." My brooch was never found. Whether it got thrown out with the debris, or whether one of those servants who couldn't stand my guts anyway had deliberately absconded with it, I never learned. Well, Hilda not only lost the brooch, she lost me too. I couldn't take it. I kept thinking of that beggar in Canton, who, just to earn a few more pennies, had driven an illuminated spike through his skull. I thought of Chris Postal, who, out of friendship for me, had woven a small miracle of gracious design around that ossified dragon's eye, and I felt that Hilda was surely a lost soul, and that I was most definitely unfit to rescue her. The other 2 pieces of jade were auctioned off shortly after Chris's death, and I tried to stay on the building as long as my resources, which is to say my borrowing power, held out. When the price had gone up to $1,800, I took a long last look at them and went home. I wish I knew what has become of them. It was my understanding and my own personal experience, limited at that, with others, that value, again, is subjective per the individual. How someone understands something is not how their neighbor will understand it. To be all too personal and tell a story that I ought not to anyways. My grandmother grew up poor in Iowa. During the Great Depression, like 1910, I think, is when she was young teen. Something. I'm really bad at dates. But anyways, she did what most women of her time did, and she married a man. And there are different stories for why she married. Her story was she married because she was the last in her friend group to get married, and so was the individual she married. They were both the last to get married, so they were paired together. Someone else's story of that is she married for the status. I think in every respect, my experience with her, she married because in all that she did, she was trying to forget who she was. My great-grandma came from Serbia, and I know very little of her story. But Grandma had to bury 3 of her siblings because they died of, like, smallpox or something. And she got grief from great-grandma about essentially not being her siblings and not being valued, not being valuable enough. And either in Grandma's grief of the situation or growing up in Iowa, she did everything she could to annihilate herself from the old roots. She forgot, well, she trained herself to not have the accent. She trained herself to forget speaking in that other language with great-grandma. The man she eventually married, my grandpa, had a German last name. I think she did everything she could to become who she wanted to be. And to distance herself as far as possible from what she never wanted to be known as. We weren't allowed to pierce our ears when we were young because we'd be confused for gypsies, in her opinion. So, all of this to say, she lived a decent life. Don't know the finite details, and we've all got our issues. But her husband, my grandpa, I always forget what it is. I think it's district attorney. He was the district attorney for Bellevue. When it became a place, essentially he was set up for a role by his friends. And so they lived well off. But I was taken care of by her when I was young. And it was the start of her dementia. Dementia sets in about 12 years before anybody recognizes the signs. So I saw her at the end of her life. There was a room that I wasn't always allowed in. It was the sitting room with all the nice furniture. And there was a closet I was definitely never allowed to touch. And she kept all of her nice, fine things in there. And every now and again, I would see her walk into the closet just to be around these nice, fine things, the necklaces and the fur coats. She never took them out. In the later years, no one visited her. She was lonely, and she was sad, and she was overcome with depression, like the chemical kind of depression. No amount of money fixed it. Not being the first people on the block to get the newest computer. Nothing fixed it. She lost her mind, forgetting her family, not being able to have anything that brought her comfort throughout her life, and being aggressive and aggravated and sad and lonely. There was a kid that I lived with in this multi-level roommate situation. Another kid had got him to be a part of this group living as a means of replacing him eventually monetarily for the rent. This kid was dating someone that was well known in Omaha for being wealthy. And he barely stayed there. He didn't have a bed in the room. The reason he rented the room was so he could dump all of the gifts that people would give him. Nice coats, backpacks, laptops, shoes, loads of it, literally in a pile in a bedroom that he didn't sleep in, and he would be gone all hours. The reason he got this shit was because people were trying to buy favor. A fucked up situation happened around fucked up people. I don't know what became of this kid. I could give a shit. But all of those things, if you had turned around to give them to someone else, they would have been valued. But to him, it was a mountain of fuck. It was a mountain of shit. No one gave a shit. No one gave a shit that their gifts to him weren't worn, weren't appreciated, weren't loved. They were just traded. Things don't matter, people do. Take care of yourself. Good night.